A German nurse treated the man who called her enemy. What could lead to a moment like this? Can compassion survive when two people stand on opposite sides of a war? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. We're truly glad you're here for another unforgettable journey into a remarkable story inspired by the human experiences of World War II. If you enjoy thoughtful stories that explore courage, dignity, and unexpected moments of humanity, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Thank you for your continued support. It means more than you know. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, do you believe someone can care for a person who sees them as an enemy? Now, settle in as we step into a story where one quiet decision begins to challenge everything either side thought they knew. Sometimes the person who saves your life is the very one you were taught to fear. Germany, April 1945. Morning arrived without birdsong. Smoke drifted above shattered rooftops, softening the jagged outlines of buildings that had survived too many months of bombardment. Broken glass glittered across empty streets where wagons no longer rolled and children no longer played. The war was nearing its end, yet every sunrise still carried the weight of uncertainty. Inside a stone monastery that had been transformed into an emergency field hospital, the air smelled of antiseptic, damp cloth, candle wax, and exhaustion. Narrow corridors echoed with hurried footsteps. Metal trays clinked against wooden tables. Somewhere beyond the thick walls, distant artillery rumbled like a storm refusing to leave. Anna Keller moved through the crowded ward with steady hands and measured steps. 25 years old, dressed in a simple white nurse's uniform beneath a faded gray coat, she seemed untouched by the panic surrounding her. Not because she felt no fear, but because fear had become another sound in the background, like rain striking old windows. She paused beside an elderly civilian whose breathing had grown shallow during the night. Her fingers adjusted a blanket before checking his pulse. A quiet nod followed. One patient stabilized. Another chance to survive until tomorrow. A young assistant hurried toward her. Anna. She turned. A convoy is arriving. How many? No one knows. There was no surprise in her expression. Every convoy meant another wave of broken bodies carried from roads, villages, and abandoned positions. Every arrival forced impossible decisions. Who could still be saved? Who would receive the last bottle of medicine? Who would simply be made comfortable before the end? Outside, engines growled through the monastery gates. Ambulances stopped one after another. Stretchers appeared immediately. Mud, blood, dust. The colors had begun to resemble one another after so many months. Anna stepped into the courtyard without hesitation. Rain from the previous evening had left shallow pools reflecting the pale morning sky. Soldiers, orderlies, and volunteers rushed between vehicles with practiced urgency. No one spoke louder than necessary. There was no energy left for shouting. The first casualties disappeared inside. The second, the third, then another stretcher emerged from the final truck. Unlike the others, this patient wore a different uniform. An American. Several faces turned. For one suspended heartbeat, movement slowed almost imperceptibly. An Allied officer, wounded deep inside German territory. The circumstances hardly mattered now. He was alive. Barely. His face was streaked with dirt and dried blood. One sleeve had been cut away to expose a heavily bandaged arm. His breathing came unevenly, interrupted by unconscious murmurs no one nearby could understand. One orderly hesitated. Another looked toward the supervising physician, waiting for instruction. The older doctor answered without raising his voice. Inside, the stretcher crossed the threshold. Anna fell into step beside it. She did not study the insignia on his uniform. She did not ask where he had fought. She did not wonder how many German soldiers had fallen before he reached this place. At that moment, none of those questions belonged inside a hospital. The corridor narrowed as they hurried toward the operating room. Candlelight flickered across worn stone walls while wheels rattled over uneven floors. Someone pushed open heavy wooden doors. The wounded officer remained unconscious. His pulse weakened beneath Anna's fingertips. She spoke only 5 calm words. Prepare the surgical instruments immediately. No one noticed that history had quietly entered the room with him. Within the next hour, 2 people raised to believe they should never trust one another would meet for the very first time. Neither of them yet understood that this silent encounter would challenge convictions built over an entire lifetime. Captain Daniel Brooks regained consciousness beneath a ceiling of dark timber beams stained by decades of smoke and candle soot. For several long moments, nothing made sense. Every breath carried a dull ache through his chest. His right shoulder throbbed with relentless rhythm, while a sharp sting spread across his ribs whenever he attempted to move. Voices drifted around him. Soft, measured, unfamiliar. He blinked against the pale afternoon light filtering through narrow monastery windows. White curtains stirred gently as a cool spring breeze slipped inside, carrying the scent of damp earth after rain. Somewhere nearby, water simmered inside a metal kettle. Linen rustled. Glass bottles clicked together. Then he noticed her. She stood beside another bed, replacing a blood-soaked dressing with movements so precise they resembled a quiet ritual rather than hurried medical work. Blonde hair rested beneath a simple nursing veil. Her sleeves were rolled neatly above her wrists. Every motion remained calm despite the endless demands surrounding her. She turned. Blue eyes met his. Neither of them spoke immediately. Daniel recognized the insignia stitched onto the sleeve beneath her apron. German. His jaw tightened. His fingers instinctively searched for a weapon that was no longer there. Nothing. Only folded blankets. The memory returned all at once. Gunfire. Collapsed stone. Smoke swallowing the road. Then darkness. Anna crossed the room carrying a small enamel tray. A glass syringe rested beside fresh bandages, scissors, and a porcelain cup filled with steaming water. She stopped beside his bed without hesitation. "You are awake." Her English carried a gentle German accent. Careful but clear. Daniel stared at her. "You?" His throat burned from dehydration. She poured water into a small metal cup. Slowly. He ignored it. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on her uniform. "You're German." A quiet nod. "I am." Silence settled between them. Outside, church bells echoed across distant hills before fading into the afternoon air. Daniel's breathing grew heavier. His voice emerged rough and strained. "Enemy." The single word lingered in the room. It carried months of propaganda, battlefield memories, fallen friends, sleepless nights, and every lesson war had carved into him. No one nearby reacted. An elderly physician continued examining another patient. A volunteer folded blankets. Somewhere farther down the corridor, someone whispered a prayer. Anna neither defended herself nor challenged his accusation. She simply placed the untouched cup closer to his hand. "You have lost a great deal of blood." Daniel refused to reach for it. "I don't need your help." "No." Her reply remained almost inaudible. "You need treatment." She examined the dressing around his shoulder. A faint stain had spread through the linen overnight. Without asking permission, she carefully loosened the outer bandage. Daniel winced despite every effort to hide the pain. Fresh stitches crossed his shoulder where fragments of shattered masonry had been removed hours earlier. The wound remained clean. No infection. The swelling had begun to ease. Anna replaced the dressing with deliberate precision, never causing unnecessary discomfort. Her concentration never wavered. Not once did she answer the insult. Not once did irritation appear across her face. To her, the man before her was not an American officer, not an occupying soldier, not a symbol of the opposing army. Only another injured human being balanced uncertainly between survival and death. Daniel watched every movement with growing confusion. This was not what he had expected. Hatred should have looked different. Cruelty should have sounded louder. Instead, only silence filled the narrow room, interrupted by distant footsteps and the quiet crackle of firewood burning inside an ancient stove. As Anna finished, securing the final knot, she stepped back and observed her work for one brief moment. The bleeding has stopped. Then she collected the used cloths and walked toward the next patient without another word, leaving Daniel alone with something far heavier than pain. For the first time since opening his eyes, certainty no longer felt as solid as it had only minutes before. Morning returned beneath a sky washed pale by lingering clouds. The monastery no longer echoed with the violence of arriving convoys, yet its quiet was deceptive. Every room held suffering measured not in loud cries, but in restrained breaths, weary glances, and the patient endurance of those waiting for either recovery or farewell. Captain Daniel Brooks had slept little. Pain faded and returned in slow waves, allowing his thoughts to wander where his body could not. He listened to the rhythm of the hospital instead. Wooden doors opened and closed with gentle creaks. Boots crossed ancient stone corridors. Someone swept scattered dust from the chapel entrance. Somewhere outside, a horse pulled an empty wagon through wet gravel before disappearing beyond the gates. Life continued despite the war. From his narrow bed, Daniel watched the ward awaken. Anna Keller appeared shortly after sunrise carrying a woven basket filled with folded linens. She greeted each patient with the same composed expression, never rushing despite the endless list of responsibilities awaiting her. An elderly farmer received fresh blankets. A frightened child with an injured ankle was offered warm broth before medicine. A young German conscript barely older than 18 accepted clean bandages with trembling gratitude. Not once did Anna linger longer beside one patient than another. Rank meant nothing. Nationality meant nothing. Only need. Daniel studied her without intending to. He searched for signs of resentment hidden beneath her calm exterior. Surely they existed. Everyone carried anger by now. The war had carved grief into every family, every village, every face. Yet each time someone reached for her assistance, she answered with the same unhurried patience. Late that morning, another stretcher entered the monastery. The wounded man wore an American uniform. His left leg had been hastily splinted with rough timber, secured by torn fabric. Dirt covered his boots. Blood darkened the sleeve wrapped around his forearm. His lips moved faintly, calling for someone who was not there. Several volunteers exchanged uncertain glances. Supplies had become dangerously scarce. Every bottle of penicillin mattered. Every clean dressing was counted. Anna approached without hesitation. "Bring him to the East Room," she said quietly. A young orderly frowned. "He is allied. I can see that. There are Germans waiting." She met his eyes with calm firmness. "There are patients waiting." The distinction silenced him. Together they carried the injured soldier inside. Daniel followed the exchange from across the corridor, unable to look away. No argument followed. No resentment filled the room. Only purposeful movement. Anna examined the fractured limb before requesting fresh water, sterile cloth, and the remaining dose of morphine allocated for the day. The physician beside her hesitated. "It is our last vial." She nodded once. "He requires it." The medicine disappeared into the wounded man's arm. Within moments, the desperate tension left his face. His breathing slowed. His shoulders relaxed. For the first time since arriving, he slept peacefully. Daniel lowered his gaze. He remembered field hospitals near the front where difficult decisions had been made under relentless pressure. Limited resources often forced impossible choices. He understood what that single injection represented. It had not been given because the patient wore an American uniform, nor because anyone expected gratitude. It had been given because someone was suffering. As afternoon sunlight stretched across the monastery floor, Daniel noticed Anna washing dried blood from her hands beneath an iron pump in the courtyard. The water turned pink before disappearing into the earth. She remained there only a moment. Then she returned inside to continue her work. Watching her, Daniel found himself confronting an unsettling realization. Everything he had expected from the woman he called an enemy had failed to appear. Instead, another. Truth stood quietly before him, asking a question he was not yet prepared to answer. The days blended together with remarkable patience. Beyond the monastery walls, the conflict still consumed roads, forests, and villages, but inside those weathered corridors another battle unfolded. One measured not by territory gained, but by every heartbeat preserved. Time no longer followed calendars. It was counted in changing dressings, lowered fevers, and the quiet relief that accompanied each sunrise. Captain Daniel Brooks recovered slowly. The physician allowed him to sit beside the window for short periods each afternoon. From there he overlooked a small courtyard where spring stubbornly reclaimed the scars of winter. Tiny green shoots pushed through cracked stone. Rainwater shimmered inside uneven cobblestones. A single apple tree, blackened by nearby shellfire, had somehow produced fresh blossoms. Life refused to surrender. Daniel found himself watching the people below more than the landscape itself. Anna crossed the courtyard countless times each day, always carrying something needed elsewhere. Sometimes it was folded blankets balanced carefully across her arms. Sometimes a tray of steaming broth. sometimes only a notebook filled with names and temperatures written in neat handwriting. She never appeared hurried, although everyone around her moved with relentless urgency. Late one afternoon, another transport reached the monastery. This time, both German and American casualties arrived together after a violent exchange several miles away. The ambulance drivers had no opportunity to separate them before departure. Stretchers entered side by side, uniforms bearing different insignias yet stained by the same dust and blood. Inside the receiving ward, fatigue stretched every member of the medical staff beyond exhaustion. Anna knelt beside a frightened German teenager whose breathing had become shallow. She examined his chest, listened carefully, adjusted his position, then asked another nurse to remain with him. Without pausing, she crossed the room toward an American corporal struggling to stay conscious. She checked his pulse, measured his breathing, pressed clean, gauze against a wound near his abdomen. "Stay awake," she said softly. "Look at me." The young soldier obeyed, though he clearly understood little of her accent. Across the room, another volunteer whispered under his breath. "They were shooting at us yesterday." An older nun arranging supplies answered quietly. "Today they are bleeding." Nothing more needed to be said. Daniel listened from the doorway. No speeches, no arguments, only simple truth. Hours passed beneath flickering lanterns as daylight disappeared behind thick clouds. Every available pair of hands remained occupied. Bowls of warm water were replaced almost as quickly as they cooled. Fresh linens vanished from storage shelves. The scent of herbs mixed with antiseptic and smoke drifting through cracked windows. Near midnight, Anna finally stopped beside a wooden bench. She lowered herself carefully, removed her spectacles, and closed her eyes for only a few seconds. Her shoulders sagged with unmistakable weariness. Before she could rest longer, someone called her name from another room. She stood immediately. No complaint escaped her lips. Daniel watched her disappear once again into the dim corridor. Only then did he notice something he had somehow overlooked during the previous days. She never asked any patient what side he had fought for. Her questions never changed. Where does it hurt? Can you breathe? Are you cold? Does the pain feel stronger? Each inquiry belonged to the person before her, never to the uniform he wore. Daniel leaned back against the stone wall, troubled by the realization settling quietly inside him. War had taught him to identify men by flags, commands, and alliances. Anna seemed to recognize only something far more fundamental. Not enemy, not ally, simply another human life entrusted, however briefly, to her care. The distinction was small enough to be spoken in a whisper, yet powerful enough to begin unraveling convictions Daniel had carried across an entire continent. Several mornings later, a quiet rain settled over the valley. Water traced silver lines across the monastery windows, blurring the distant hills into soft shadows. The steady rhythm against the old roof muted every sound beyond the walls, as though the world itself had paused for a single peaceful breath before remembering there was still a war to finish. Captain Daniel Brooks was finally able to walk short distances with assistance. His injured shoulder remained stiff, and every movement reminded him of the collapsing masonry that had nearly ended his life. Even so, each careful step through the corridor felt like reclaiming something the battlefield had almost stolen forever. The physician encouraged him to move. "Strength returns slowly," the elderly man said. "Let your body remember." Daniel nodded. He spent much of the afternoon wandering through the monastery, careful not to disturb those still confined to their beds. The building revealed details he had overlooked during the first difficult days. Ancient stone arches supported narrow passageways polished smooth by centuries of footsteps. Faded religious paintings survived on cracked plaster walls. Candles flickered before a weathered wooden cross despite the daylight filtering through tall windows. Near the chapel entrance, he heard familiar voices. Anna was speaking quietly with the senior physician while organizing medical records. "The quinine is nearly gone," the doctor said. "I know. We may not receive another shipment." She closed the ledger without visible frustration. "Then we will use what remains where it can still change an outcome." There was no bitterness in her answer, only acceptance. Daniel continued walking, intending not to interrupt. As he reached the small herb garden behind the monastery, he noticed an elderly nun gathering fresh chamomile blossoms despite the drizzle. She smiled gently when she recognized him. "You are recovering well." Thanks to your staff. She shook her head. Mostly thanks to Anna. Daniel glanced toward the building. She works harder than anyone. The nun followed his gaze. She always has. There was affection in her voice, but also quiet admiration earned over many years. My father once told me courage belonged to soldiers, Daniel admitted. The elderly woman smiled faintly. Many believe that. She bent carefully to collect another flower before continuing. Anna's father was the village physician. Daniel listened without speaking. He treated whoever arrived at his door. Farmers, travelers, children, even strangers passing through during difficult years. She paused for a moment, remembering. When Anna was still a little girl, she asked him why he never refused anyone. What did he say? The nun looked toward the rain falling beyond the garden wall. He told her that illness never asked a person's name before entering a home. Silence settled comfortably between them. She remembered those words. Daniel watched droplets slide from the edge of a rosemary branch. So she became a nurse. Not because war demanded it. The older woman folded her hands. Because compassion had already become part of her long before the uniforms arrived. A distant bell echoed through the monastery courtyard. The conversation ended naturally as both turned toward the sound. Daniel remained beneath the covered walkway long after the nun disappeared inside. He thought about the battlefield, about orders, about loyalty, about every lesson that had divided the world into simple categories. Friend, enemy, us, them. Then he considered the woman carrying trays, changing dressings, and sacrificing sleep without ever asking which flag a wounded man had followed into battle. Perhaps her principles had not been shaped by war at all. Perhaps they had survived because they had been formed long before it began. The realization lingered with him through the quiet rain, leaving behind a question stronger than any certainty he had once carried. If compassion could endure where hatred seemed inevitable, what else had the war taught him that was no longer true? The following evening arrived beneath an uneasy stillness. Even the wind seemed reluctant to cross the valley, leaving the monastery wrapped in a silence so complete that every distant sound carried unusual weight. Somewhere beyond the surrounding hills, artillery muttered like fading thunder. No one inside believed the front had moved far enough away to promise safety. The hospital settled into its familiar nighttime rhythm. Lanterns replaced daylight. Footsteps softened. Conversations became whispers drifting through narrow passageways lined with worn stone. Most patients slept at last, their breathing blending into a quiet chorus that spoke of fragile survival rather than complete recovery. Captain Daniel Brooks rested lightly, awakened now and then by discomfort in his shoulder. The physician had assured him his condition continued to improve, but healing rarely followed a straight path. Some nights the body remembered every injury more vividly than the mind wished to recall. Across the ward, Anna Keller finished recording temperatures in a small leather notebook. She extinguished one lantern to preserve precious oil before carrying fresh blankets toward the children's room. A young girl smiled weakly as Anna tucked the blanket beneath her chin. "You'll be warmer now." The child nodded before drifting back to sleep. Anna stepped quietly into the corridor. At that exact moment, the first explosion shattered the silence. The blast struck somewhere beyond the monastery walls. Windows rattled violently. Dust rained from ancient ceiling beams. Several patients woke instantly. Another explosion followed. Closer. This time the building trembled beneath everyone's feet. "Basement," someone shouted. The senior physician immediately began directing volunteers. "Move those who can walk. Protect the surgical room. Nurses, with me." The peaceful rhythm dissolved into urgent motion. Lanterns swung wildly. Blankets slipped from beds. Orderlies lifted stretchers while frightened civilians searched desperately for loved ones through the growing confusion. Daniel pushed himself upright despite the sharp protest from his wounded shoulder. "What happened?" An orderly hurried past. "Shelling." Before Daniel could stand fully, another deafening impact erupted outside. The northern wall groaned. Stone fragments crashed into the courtyard. Somewhere nearby, terrified horses screamed. Smoke drifted through broken windows, filling the corridor with the bitter smell of shattered brick and burning timber. Anna reached Daniel's bedside. "You cannot walk alone. I can help. You can recover." She turned toward another patient whose fractured leg prevented any movement. Without hesitation, She and another volunteer lifted the stretcher together. The hallway narrowed as frightened people struggled toward the staircase leading below ground. Then everything changed. A tremendous detonation struck the eastern side of the monastery. The force extinguished several lanterns at once. Darkness swallowed the corridor. A section of the ceiling cracked overhead. Someone screamed. Daniel looked upward. A massive wooden beam, loosened by the explosion, broke free from the ancient roof. It began falling directly toward him. There was no time to move. No warning beyond a sharp crack echoing through the darkness. Anna saw it one heartbeat sooner. She released the stretcher, crossed the narrow distance in 2 swift strides, and threw herself against Daniel with every ounce of strength she possessed. Both of them crashed onto the cold stone floor. The beam struck where he had been standing less than a second earlier. Its impact exploded into splintered wood, shattered plaster, and choking clouds of dust. Silence followed, not because the shelling had ended, but because everyone nearby had frozen. Daniel struggled to breathe beneath the weight pressing against him. Anna remained motionless, one protective arm still wrapped across his shoulders. Only then did he notice the fresh blood slowly spreading along the sleeve of her uniform, where flying debris had torn through the fabric. For the first time since entering the monastery, Captain Daniel Brooks no longer saw the woman above him as the enemy who had treated his wounds. He saw only the person who had willingly placed herself between death and a man who had once refused even to accept a cup of water from her hands. The shelling faded as suddenly as it had begun. One explosion rolled away into the distance, followed by another farther across the valley, until only scattered echoes remained. Dust continued drifting through broken rafters, catching the first pale light of dawn that slipped between fractured stones. The monastery had survived, though not without fresh scars. For several moments, no one moved. Then the hospital awakened again. Someone called for stretchers. Another search for lanterns buried beneath fallen debris. Prayers mixed with hurried instructions as nurses and volunteers returned instinctively to their duties. Captain Daniel Brooks pushed himself upright, ignoring the sharp protest in his shoulder. His attention never left Anna Keller. She remained seated where she had fallen, one hand pressed against the cut along her upper arm. Blood seeped through torn fabric, but her breathing remained steady. Tiny fragments of plaster clung to her hair, now loosened from its careful arrangement. Daniel knelt beside her. "You're hurt." She glanced briefly toward the wound as though noticing it for the first time. "It is only a cut." "It doesn't look like only a cut," she answered with the faintest smile. "There are others who need attention first." Before Daniel could respond, she was already attempting to stand. He reached out instinctively. "Wait." She paused. Without another word, he supported her elbow as she regained her balance. It was a simple gesture, almost unnoticed amid the confusion surrounding them, yet it carried a significance neither of them acknowledged aloud. Moments earlier she had protected him without hesitation. Now their roles had shifted, however slightly. Together they crossed the damaged corridor toward the treatment room. Inside, chaos had given way to determined order. The elderly physician examined victims injured during the bombardment while assistants organized whatever supplies remained intact. Broken shelves had scattered bottles across the floor. Several cabinets lay overturned. Even so, the work never stopped. Anna quietly rolled back her sleeve. The physician inspected the injury. Fortunately, nothing deep. He cleaned the wound before wrapping fresh linen around her arm. "You should rest." She looked toward the crowded ward. "I cannot. You have been awake nearly 2 days. There are still patients waiting." The doctor sighed with gentle resignation. "I expected that answer." Daniel watched the exchange in silence. He had seen soldiers' refuse evacuation before. He had admired such determination on the battlefield. Yet somehow this quiet refusal felt different. It sought no recognition. It carried no pride. It simply accepted responsibility. Later that afternoon, after emergency repairs secured the damaged roof, calm slowly returned. Daniel found Anna standing alone beside the courtyard well, rinsing dust from her hands. The bucket reflected the gray morning sky. He approached carefully. "You saved my life." She continued washing away the dried blood. "I reacted. You could have stepped back. So could anyone. But they didn't." Only then did she look at him. For the first time since they had met, neither uniform seemed to matter. "I saw someone in danger," she said. I did what I hoped another nurse would do if my own brother were lying there. Daniel lowered his eyes. The words settled heavily inside him. Not because they accused him, because they did not. He remembered the bitterness with which he had spoken days earlier. Enemy. The single word now sounded strangely small compared with everything she had done since. He searched for something worthy to say. An apology. A thank you. Anything. None seemed sufficient. Anna lifted the bucket once more and carried it toward the laundry room before another patient called her name from inside. She answered immediately, disappearing through the doorway without waiting for gratitude. Daniel remained beside the old stone well long after she had gone. The woman he had believed belonged on the opposite side of history had quietly overturned something far greater than his assumptions. Without argument, without judgment, without asking for anything in return. For the first time since the war had begun, he understood that courage did not always wear a uniform, and honor was not determined by the flag stitched onto someone's sleeve. 3 days after the bombardment, the valley awakened beneath clear skies for the first time in weeks. Sunlight spilled across the monastery courtyard, warming broken stones that still bore fresh cracks from the attack. Carpenters repaired damaged beams, while volunteers replaced shattered panes with rough wooden boards. The building carried its wounds openly, yet its purpose remained unchanged. Inside, recovery had become the quiet rhythm of each passing hour. Captain Daniel Brooks had regained much of his strength. The physician finally removed the heavy sling supporting his shoulder and encouraged gentle movement to restore flexibility. Although every motion still carried a dull reminder of the past, the sharpest pain had begun to fade. The order reached the monastery shortly before noon. An Allied reconnaissance unit had entered the surrounding district. Arrangements were being made to transfer every recovered American serviceman to military care before nightfall. The news spread quickly. Several soldiers welcomed it with visible relief. Others stared silently through the windows, uncertain whether they felt gratitude for rescue or sadness at leaving behind the people who had carried them through the darkest days of their lives. Daniel folded the letter slowly after reading it. His departure, once desperately desired, suddenly felt strangely incomplete. That afternoon he found Anna arranging medicines inside a narrow storage room lined with wooden shelves. Small glass bottles stood beside bundles of dried herbs, carefully labeled despite dwindling supplies. Dust floated through shafts of sunlight entering from a high window. "You'll be leaving," she said before turning around. He paused. "You already know." The physician received the notice. For a brief moment neither of them spoke. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It had become familiar. Daniel stepped closer. "You could come with us." She looked up. "The front is moving west. You'll be safer." Anna placed another bottle into its proper place before answering. "My place is here. The fighting may continue. There will still be wounded. You've done enough." A gentle smile appeared across her face. "I will decide when enough has been done." There was no defiance in her voice, only certainty. Daniel searched for another argument, but found none. Everything he wished to say seemed smaller than the conviction standing quietly before him. Outside the doorway, another volunteer called Anna's name. A farmer had arrived with an elderly woman suffering from severe pneumonia after days spent hiding inside a cellar. Anna answered immediately. "I'll be there." She turned toward Daniel. "Excuse me." Without hesitation, she crossed the corridor and knelt beside the frightened patient, speaking reassuring words while preparing warm compresses and medicine. The arrival of another stranger had erased every personal concern from her thoughts. Daniel remained where he stood, watching. He finally understood why she could never leave simply because one chapter of the war was ending. Her responsibility had never belonged to armies. It belonged to whoever appeared before her needing help. As evening settled across the monastery, an Allied truck rolled through the gates. Its olive green paint contrasted sharply with the pale stone walls. American soldiers stepped down, calling names from a handwritten list. One by one, recovering servicemen gathered their few belongings. Daniel picked up the worn blanket that had covered him during countless difficult nights. Carefully folded inside, it was the small wooden cross the elderly nun had placed near his bedside after the shelling. He carried both toward the entrance. Before climbing into the truck, he looked back one final time. Across the courtyard, Anna was helping the elderly woman into a chair beneath the fading light. She never noticed him watching. Or perhaps she did. Either way, She did not wave. She simply continued caring for the life entrusted to her at that very moment. Daniel understood then that some people never ask history to remember their names. They choose instead to leave their kindness in the lives they quietly change, one person at a time. 20 years passed. Wars ended. Borders shifted. Cities rebuilt themselves from ruins that once seemed impossible to overcome. New generations grew up beneath peaceful skies, learning about battles from textbooks instead of distant explosions. Time softened many memories, but it never erased the moments that had truly changed a life. Captain Daniel Brooks carried one memory more carefully than all the others. His hair had turned silver. The scars across his shoulder had faded into pale lines almost hidden beneath age. Yet every spring, when rain tapped gently against his window, he found himself remembering an old monastery. Tucked among the German hills and the quiet woman who had never asked him which side he belonged to before saving his life. One afternoon, Daniel stood before a hall filled with young military medical cadets. Their uniforms were crisp. Their notebooks rested open across polished desks. Most had never witnessed war. They looked toward the retired officer expecting stories about strategy, victories, or famous commanders. Instead, Daniel placed a single faded photograph upon the lectern. The image showed a damaged stone courtyard. Near its center stood a young nurse wearing a simple white apron beneath a weathered coat. She was not looking toward the camera. She was helping an elderly patient take another careful step. No medals appeared in the photograph. No flags. No celebration. Only quiet service. Daniel allowed several moments of silence before speaking. The bravest person I met during the war never carried a rifle. The room became perfectly still. I believed she was my enemy before I even knew her name. He paused. She never believed I was hers. No one interrupted. Daniel described the monastery, the overcrowded wards, the shortages, the bombardment. The beam that would have crushed him had someone else not chosen, without hesitation, to stand between him and death. He spoke not with dramatic emotion, but with calm gratitude earned through decades of reflection. One cadet finally raised a hand. "Sir, why did she save you?" Daniel smiled softly. It was the same question that had once echoed through his own heart. Because she was a nurse before she was anything else. The answer settled over the room more powerfully than any speech. After the lecture ended, the young cadets quietly approached the photograph one by one. Some studied the damaged courtyard. Others looked only at the nurse whose name they had never heard before that afternoon. Daniel carefully returned the photograph to its envelope. Its edges had become worn from years of handling. Inside the same envelope rested another keepsake. A small handwritten note received months after the war through an international relief organization. Only one sentence appeared upon the yellowed paper. "I hope your shoulder healed well. Keep living a life worthy of being saved." There was no signature. None was needed. Daniel folded the note with the same care he always had. As he stepped outside, children laughed in a nearby park where spring flowers covered the grass. Their voices drifted through warm afternoon air, untouched by fear, untouched by hatred, untouched by everything one generation had sacrificed to leave behind. He looked toward the bright sky and smiled. History often remembered generals, battles, and treaties. But the future survived because ordinary people quietly refused to surrender their humanity. Anna Keller never changed the outcome of the war. She changed the heart of one man. And through him, countless others learned that compassion is never a sign of weakness. It is the quiet courage that remains long after every battlefield has fallen silent. She never raised her voice. She raised the standard.